So earlier tonight, about an hour or so ago, I asked Lord Kirkhope, former UK Immigration Minister and former leader of the Conservatives, should I say, in the European Parliament. I asked him what he made of the message Rishi Sunak was taking to Grenada.
First of all, the European political community, or as we wanted to call it, the European Political Forum, is actually an informal gathering which doesn't have any real decision-making powers, ultimately. It's merely an opportunity for the members of the EU, the 27 states, to talk to another nearly 20 countries that are in the sort of European area of the world, and to perhaps, just have chats about areas of security, matters to do with international relations and so on. But in no way is anything that the EPC discusses going to be binding on either the EU or indeed, I think, probably on any individual member state.
So why is the Prime Minister going there with such gusto, writing op-eds in the Times and essentially banging the drum for a get-tough policy, which he claims has been successful so far in the UK in terms of small boats, 20% down on this time last year, whereas Europe is getting record numbers?
Well, yes, quite. And I think discussing it with the Prime Minister of Italy, which is having probably one of the biggest crises possible in terms of numbers of asylum seekers and other migrants arriving on their shores, is obviously quite relevant in the sense that the Prime Minister has put this issue right at the very front of his priorities, and talking with her would seem to be quite a sensible thing to do. But that isn't the same thing at all as taking part in or getting involved in what is currently going on in the EU, which is, of course, to try and find some formula between the EU states on the sharing of responsibility for asylum seekers and migrants, which is really very important, and where I believe that the UK should somehow get itself involved and associated with those things, rather than just dealing on a bilateral basis with individual countries like Italy.
Yeah, there are a number of countries which don't want to do so-called burden sharing. Ireland says we've had 100,000 so far. We think we've done quite enough per capita. And the likes of Hungary and Slovakia, they say we don't want this kind of migration. One wonders where this is going. What hope do you have for this purported deal between the UK and Frontex, the EU's border agency, for intelligence sharing on migration?
Yeah, I've got no problem with that at all. I was the author, when I was in the European Parliament, of what were known as the Dublin Agreements. You mentioned Ireland a moment ago.
Yes.
The Dublin Agreements were there to share the burden and share the responsibility between EU states for illegal migration and asylum seekers. And I have to say, of all the things I did in my 17 years in the European Parliament, being responsible for that sort of thing was probably one of my biggest failures.
Really? Why?
The reason I failed and why those sort of initiatives have previously failed is because individual countries, even in the EU, want to maintain their own border controls to the extent of deciding who comes and goes from their countries. So getting agreement, particularly to share responsibility, has been extremely difficult. But the EU is working on it again now, and despite sort of protests and difficulties with certain countries, and I can think of certainly Hungary as being a good example of one, I think that is what they're trying to achieve. It just seems to me that our position is that we ought to be part of those discussions. At the moment, we're trying to sort of just pick bits and pieces to suit us. Certainly Frontex is important, and if we can get a deal where Frontex, that's the European Union frontier forces, come more into evidence in the Channel, for instance, then that would be extremely helpful in terms of Rishi Sunak's one aim of stopping those boats, which we all want to see. But, it is difficult because you can only go so far.
Well, this is it, Lord
individual
Kirkhope.
deals.
Yes, the emphasis seems to be we've got to stop those boats getting across the Channel. We've got to stop those boats getting across the Mediterranean. But when it comes to agreements with the exporter countries, so those on the north of Africa, countries like Sudan, like Eritrea, some countries in West Africa, where people are desperately unhappy, bad governance, really poor relations between the EU governments and their own, sometimes propping up really bad African governments. Nothing's happening there.
Well, I mean, I when I was the immigration minister, my line really was this. The countries that claim to be democracies, that claim to be free, that claim to have good human rights records, of which most of these origination countries claim to be, if they are not actually countries that are maintaining such situations, then it seems to me that they must take back the people that come and claim asylum in Europe, whether it's in the EU itself or whether it's in our country. Because in my day, what would happen was if anybody failed to meet the strict criteria of the 51 Refugee Convention, which have to be the criteria that are applied, i.e. the people couldn't show that they were immediately in danger of being executed or incarcerated for life, which really is what it's all about, then I would demand that people were returned to their place of origination, not to the next country along the line, but back to where they started from. And if those countries in Africa and elsewhere in the world that make these great claims, and those are countries which we are giving aid to in quite large amounts, I would make it clear in those days, and did make it clear, that if they would not take back those people who failed those criteria, then they could expect not to be receiving the kind of resources from us that they had previously received. And that, in most cases, I have to say to you, back in the 90s, did work. And it's something which I think our government and other European governments have to now turn to.
Final thought, Suella Braverman, both in Washington last week and then in Manchester this week, talking about gusts of winds becoming hurricanes and almost echoing great replacement theory, the kind of stuff that people are now comparing with Enoch Powell in 1968. As a loyal Conservative, what do you think?
Well, I can only say to you this, that this is a massively sensitive area. It's an area where actually practical policies and efficient operations are what one needs to do to protect the people of this country and the security of this country, and indeed to maintain our borders. Rhetoric has no place whatsoever. And I have to say to you that if we want to maintain good community relations and we want to maintain respectability in international terms, we do not need that kind of expression.
Lord Kirkhope, former Tory immigration minister, speaking to me earlier. Text 87222